Working as a night security guard at a local mall was never something I considered dangerous or even particularly interesting. It was supposed to be easy money. Just walk around a few times, watch the cameras, and make sure nothing got stolen or vandalized after hours. Most nights, the only things I had to worry about were flickering lights or the occasional malfunctioning door. But all of that changed one night, and I still can't explain what happened. It was a Thursday, around 11 p.m., and the mall had been closed for a few hours. As usual, I was doing my rounds, walking the long, dimly lit hallways, checking doors, making sure everything was locked up tight. It was always so quiet after the mall closed, almost unnaturally so. The kind of silence where every footstep echoes louder than it should, where you can hear your own breathing. I was passing by the row of clothing stores when I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A small figure, standing just inside one of the stores. At first, I thought it was a kid, maybe someone who had snuck in for fun after hours. Kids did stupid things like that all the time. I figured he'd gotten locked inside the store when they closed, and now he was probably scared or trying to play a prank on me.
Hey, kid.
I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hall.
What are you doing in there? The mall's closed.
The kid didn't move. He was standing near the back of the store, facing me, but his posture was all wrong. He was too still. Something about the way he just stood there, completely motionless, sent a shiver down my spine. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight through the glass storefront to get a better look. That's when I realized something was off. The kid didn't look right, you know. His clothes were strange, too old-fashioned, like something a kid would have worn decades ago. And his face, it was pale, almost grayish in the dim light. But what really got me was his eyes. They were wide open, staring blankly at me with no emotion, no expression at all. Just empty. I felt a knot of unease twist in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I called out again, my voice a little more urgent this time.
Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?
Nothing. He didn't even blink. I started to wonder if he was hurt, or if maybe he wasn't even aware of where he was. But then, as I took another step toward the glass, the light from my flat passed over him, and I could see through him. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe the reflection of the flashlight on the glass was somehow causing this. But no. I could see through the kid's body, right to the display rack behind him, like he wasn't even there, like he was made of nothing. I froze, my mind racing. My first thought was that it had to be a reflection, a weird trick of the light. But as I moved closer, the kid didn't vanish or flicker like a reflection should. He just stood there, staring at me, his face completely blank. My heart started pounding in my chest. This wasn't a kid who had snuck in after hours. This wasn't even a kid. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. I could feel the panic rising in me, but I couldn't look away. There was something about his eyes, so hollow, so lifeless, that made me feel like he was looking right through me, like he could see something I couldn't. And then, without warning, the kid moved. It wasn't a normal movement. He didn't walk or run. He just shifted, suddenly closer to the glass, like he'd glided across the room in an instant. 1 second, he was at the back of the store, and the next he was right in front of me, standing just on the other side of the glass. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The flashlight shook in my hand, the beam flickering slightly. The kid's face was inches from the glass now, but there was still no emotion, no sign of recognition. He just stared at me, like I was some kind of animal on display, I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually I found the strength to move. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off him until I reached the corner of the hallway. As soon as I turned the corner, I broke into a sprint, my legs shaking as I made my way back to the security office. I locked the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I quickly flipped through the security cameras, pulling up the feed from the store where I'd seen the kid. But the store was empty. There was no one there. I rewound the footage, searching for any sign of movement, any glimpse of that strange figure. But there was nothing. It was like he'd never been there at all. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the monitor, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I thought I had. Maybe it was a hallucination. Maybe I was just exhausted from too many late nights. But no matter how hard I tried to explain it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The way the kid had looked at me, like he wasn't seeing me, but something deeper, something inside me, left me with this gnawing sense of dread. The next night, I was back on duty. I was on edge the whole time, jumping at every little sound, every flicker of the lights. I couldn't stop thinking about the kid, about how I'd seen right through him like he wasn't real, like he was an apparition. Around midnight, as I was watching the monitors, I caught movement on one of the cameras. My heart skipped a beat. It was the kid again, standing in the same store, in the same corner, staring blankly at the camera. I watched in horror as the image on the screen flickered and the kid moved, again in that unnatural, gliding way. He was closer now, standing just inside the doorway of the store, staring directly at the camera as if he knew I was watching. I could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio, calling for backup. But before I could even say a word, the camera feed cut out. The screen went black. When it came back on, the store was empty again. I quit that job a few days later. I couldn't stay there, knowing that thing was still wandering around, watching me. I don't know what it was, or why it was there, but I do know one thing. I'll never forget the way it looked at me. Like it wasn't really a kid at all, but something far more sinister, something that didn't belong in this world. I travel a lot for work. Most of the time, I'm staying in nondescript hotels that all look the same, beige walls, dim lighting, creaky floors. It's nothing glamorous, just a bed to sleep in before the next long day. I had gotten used to the routine, used to the loneliness of it all. But one night during a work trip, I stayed in a motel that I'll never forget. It was an old place, one of those off-the-highway motels with faded paint and an almost eerie silence. The kind where the receptionist barely glances up when you check in, and the rooms feel like they haven't been updated in decades. When I got to my room, I was exhausted. All I wanted was to sleep, but there was something off about the room the moment I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the air too still, like the room had been waiting for something. The room smelled musty, like it was poorly ventilated, faded smell of cigarette that had embedded into the fabrics in the room, and strangely, it smelled of feet. I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired. I put my bag down, got ready for bed, and turned off the light. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The room felt wrong. I fell asleep at some point. Suddenly, I woke up and realized the room was freezing cold. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to understand what was going on. The windows were closed. It was summer. I looked at my phone. It was 1 a.m. I had slept for only an hour. I looked around the room, still quite puzzled, and I couldn't shake that feeling that I was being watched. I tried to tell myself I was just imagining things, but then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't. It was tall, too tall, and it was standing completely still, almost blending into the darkness. My heart started to race. I quickly reached over and turned on the lamp beside the bed, the warm light flooding the room. The figure didn't disappear. It shifted. It moved, just slightly, like it was responding to the light. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was still there, in the corner, but now it was moving, almost like it was getting ready to take a step forward. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare, wide-eyed, as it slowly shifted toward me. And then, before I could even react, it lunged. I screamed, raising my hand to shield myself, expecting to feel the weight of the figure crashing into me, knocking me back into the bed. But instead, the figure turned into a cloud of thick black smoke, rushing at me faster than I could blink. It passed through me, freezing cold, and I let out another scream as I felt the icy air blast through my body. My skin prickled with cold, and for a second it felt like I couldn't breathe, like my chest was full of frost. Then, nothing. I don't remember anything after that. No matter how hard I try, it's just blank. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the morning, lying in bed, drenched in sweat, feeling like I'd run a marathon. My body was sore, my muscles ached, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. But the second I opened my eyes, I remembered. The figure, the smoke, the cold. I shot up in bed, heart racing again, and looked around the room. The sun was shining through the curtains, the morning light spilling into the room, making everything look so normal, like nothing had happened at all. For a moment, I questioned my own sanity. Was it just a nightmare? Did I imagine it all? I quickly packed up my stuff, still shaken, and went down to check out. The receptionist was just as dismissive as when I checked in, barely glancing up from her phone as she handed me my receipt. I thought about saying something, asking if anyone else had ever reported strange things happening in that room. But I didn't. I just wanted to get out of there. I left the hotel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, things got worse. It started with small things, forgetting where I put my keys, losing track of time, waking up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I'd look at the clock and realize hours had passed, but I couldn't remember what I'd been doing. And then the nightmares started. Every night, I'd dream of the same thing, lying in that hotel bed, staring at the corner of the room. The figure would be there, watching me, waiting. In the dream, it never lunged at me, but it was always getting closer. Each night, a little closer than before. And every time I woke up, I felt drained, like the life was being slowly pulled out of me. It wasn't just the nightmares, though. During the day, I started losing more and more time. I'd find myself standing in rooms I didn't remember walking into or holding things I didn't remember picking up. My family started noticing too. I'd forget entire conversations, or they'd catch me staring blankly at nothing for minutes at a time. At first, I thought I was just stressed. Maybe it was work, maybe it was exhaustion. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. It was something else, something darker. One night, I woke up from the nightmare, again drenched in sweat. But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked at the clock. It was 3:15 a.m. The room was pitch black, except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable, when I felt it. Cold air. It rushed over me, just like in the hotel. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked around the room. Everything was quiet, but I knew, deep down, that it was here. The figure. It had followed me. For the next few weeks, I was stuck in this cycle, waking up every night at 3:15 a.m., feeling that blast of cold air, losing more time during the day. I tried everything: medication, sleeping pills, even therapy. But nothing worked. Whatever had come through me that night in the hotel wasn't leaving. It was draining me piece by piece. Then, one night, I didn't wake up at 3:15 a.m. I woke up later, maybe 5 or 6 in the morning. But this time, I wasn't in bed. I was standing in the middle of my living room, staring at my reflection in the window. Except it wasn't my reflection. Face looking back at me was hollow, gaunt, like something was slowly taking over. I reached out to touch the glass, and my hand went through it, just like smoke. That's when I realized it hadn't just followed me. It was becoming me. The nightmares haven't stopped. Every night, the figure gets closer. And every morning, I wake up feeling a little less like myself. I've lost weeks now. Sometimes, my family will ask me where I've been, but I can't answer them. I don't know. I'm afraid that one day, I won't wake up at all. Or worse, I'll wake up, but it won't be me anymore. Whatever happened, that night in the hotel, it changed me, and I'm not sure I'll ever be the same again. The question is, how much longer do I have before I'm completely gone? It was the summer I spent with my grandparents, out at their old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where you can drive for miles and not see another house. The only sounds at night are the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional distant bark of a dog. It was supposed to be a quiet, peaceful break from the city, but one night changed everything. I'd been staying in the guest room on the second floor, a small, cozy space with an old wooden bed and a window that overlooked the backyard. The window was high up, probably about 15 feet off the ground, and beyond it, all you could see was an empty field that stretched out into the woods. During the day, the sunlight would filter through the trees, making everything look warm and inviting. But at night, that same window felt like a portal into something darker, something wrong. It started on the third night. I'd just gotten into bed, trying to adjust to the stillness of the farmhouse. The house was always too quiet for me. No traffic, no city noises, just silence. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard a soft tapping sound. It was so faint at first, I thought it was just the wind knocking a branch against the house. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like it was coming from the window. I sat up, my heart already starting to race. I didn't want to move, didn't want to look. I kept telling myself there was no way anyone could be out there. My window was way too high, and there was no ledge or balcony for anyone to stand on. Still, the tapping continued, steady, deliberate, like someone was standing just outside, waiting for me to notice. Finally, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I turned slowly, my eyes locked on the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure on the other side of the glass, a dark silhouette, standing perfectly still. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I was on the second floor. There was no ladder outside, no balcony. How could anyone be standing there? I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the trees outside. But then the tapping came again, louder and more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't want to move, didn't want to get any closer, but I had to know what was out there. Slowly, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The room lit up in an instant, and for a moment, the tapping stopped. I got out of bed, my hands trembling as I approached the window. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I took a deep breath and, with a shaking hand, pulled back the curtain. Nothing, just the empty field, bathed in pale moonlight. No figure, no shadow, no one. The tapping had stopped completely. I let out a shaky laugh, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination. Maybe the window had rattled in the wind. Maybe I was just tired, adjusting to the quiet of the country. I closed the curtain, climbed back into bed, and tried to fall asleep, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me long into the night. The next morning, I told my grandparents about it over breakfast. My grandpa just chuckled and said the old farmhouse was full of creaks and groans, nothing to worry about. But my grandma, she didn't laugh. She just gave me a strange look, her eyes narrowing slightly.
Sometimes things don't leave this place.
She said quietly, almost to herself. When I asked her what she meant, she just shook her head and changed the subject. That night, I was more on edge than ever. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. I lay in bed for hours staring at the window, waiting. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. Nothing happened. I was starting to think I had imagined it all when I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I jumped out of bed immediately, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it directly at the window. The tapping stopped, just like the night before. I stood there, staring at the curtain, my mind racing. I didn't want to pull it back again. I didn't want to see whatever was on the other side. But I couldn't just ignore it, not this time. I forced myself to step forward, slowly reaching for the curtain. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling, then yanked it open. The figure was there. A face was pressed against the glass, pale and expressionless, with hollow, empty eyes staring right at me. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. Human, but not quite. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth was slightly open, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It was standing on nothing, floating just outside the window, inches from my face. I screamed, stumbling backward and falling to the floor. My phone flew out of my hand, the flashlight flickering wildly. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My grandparents came rushing down the hallway, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. All I could do was point to the window. My grandpa went into the room, turning on the light and pulling back the curtain. "There's nothing here, kid," he said, his voice calm but serious. "You probably had a bad dream." But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't imagining it. That night, I slept on the couch downstairs, but I couldn't shake the image of that face at the window. The next morning, I went outside to check the ground beneath my window, hoping to find some kind of explanation, footprints, a ladder, something. But there was nothing. Just undisturbed grass and dirt. I spent the rest of the summer at my grandparents' place, but I never slept in that room again. I stayed downstairs, close to the noise of the TV or the sound of my grandpa's old radio. Every now and then, I'd catch my grandma watching me, her eyes dark with worry, like she knew more than she was letting on. Before I left, she pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget.
That room. It's always been strange. I don't know what you saw, but you weren't the first.
I haven't been back to that farmhouse since. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it. The faint sound of tapping on my window, like something is waiting to be let in. When I was a kid, I always heard strange noises coming from the attic. It wasn't just the usual creaks and groans that houses make at night. It was something different. Footsteps, shuffling sounds, like someone was moving up there, slow and deliberate. I used to tell my parents, but they'd always dismiss it, saying it was just the house settling or the wind. But I knew better. There was someone up there. For years, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing. But when I turned 12, everything changed. It was late, around midnight, when I woke up to the sound of something heavy being dragged across the attic floor. The noise was louder than usual, and it sent a chill down my spine. I lay there, frozen, listening as the dragging stopped and the footsteps began again, slow and deliberate, moving directly above my room. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I don't know what compelled me, but I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept out of bed, determined to face whatever was up there. I told myself it had to be a raccoon or some kind of animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I tiptoed down the hallway toward the attic stairs, the sound of those footsteps still echoing in my ears. Pull string for the attic door dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the draft. I hesitated, my hands shaking as I reached for it. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. With a deep breath, I yanked the string, and the attic door creaked open, the wooden ladder unfolding like a skeleton's arm reaching down to me. I climbed the ladder slowly, one step at a time, the darkness above seeming to swallow the weak beam of my flashlight. As soon as I stepped into the attic, the temperature dropped. The air was stale and thick with the smell of mold and dust, but there was something cold and unnatural. And then I saw him, crouched in the far corner of the attic, huddled between old boxes and broken furniture, was a man. His back was to me, his body twisted and hunched, like he was frozen mid-movement. His clothes were old and ragged, covered in dust, and he wasn't moving. At first, I thought he was just some squatter, maybe a homeless man who had found his way into the house. But as I took a step closer, the beam of my flashlight flickering over him, I realized something was horribly wrong. I could see through him. His outline was faint, flickering like a badly tuned TV. I felt my throat tighten with fear as I stumbled back, my hands trembling. My heart pounded as I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. It just sat there, motionless, like it hadn't heard me. But then, slowly, it began to move. The man straightened up, standing to his full height, but he was impossibly thin, his body almost skeletal, like he hadn't eaten in years. He didn't turn around right away. Instead, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something. Then, slowly, painfully, he turned to face me. I'll never forget what I saw. His face. It wasn't human. It was twisted and deformed, the skin stretched too tight across his skull. His eyes were hollow, dark pits where there should have been life, and his face looked like it was frozen in a state of perpetual desperation. His face was wrong, unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. I screamed, stumbling backward, nearly falling down the ladder. My flashlight flickered again, the beam stuttering as I tried to get away. But before I could run, the man spoke. His voice was low, raspy, like he hadn't spoken in decades.
Help me.
I didn't stay to hear more. I bolted down the ladder, slammed the attic door shut, and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I sat there in the dark, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My dad sighed, looked at the sky as if praying. He finally agreed to check the attic, thinking I'd had a nightmare. But when he came down, his face was ashen, his hands trembling. "There's nothing up there," he said. But I knew by the look in his eyes that he had seen something. We were not in a financial position to move. My school and my parents' workplace were relatively close by. Moving was not something my family could handle at that time. Besides, apart from the noise, nothing else, nothing life-threatening had ever happened. I didn't go near the attic again, but the noises continued. The footsteps, the dragging. And now that I knew who or what was up there, the fear was worse than ever. It wasn't until years later, after we had moved out, that I learned the truth. One evening, I was visiting my grandparents, and we were talking about the old house. I brought up the attic, and that's when my grandmother's face changed. She looked at me with a mix of fear and sadness, and then, almost reluctantly, she told me the story. After my dad had gone up to the attic that night, he researched the history of the property. He had told my grandparents about the man who was killed in the attic years ago. The man in the attic wasn't just a squatter. He had lived in that house over 50 years ago, but not by choice. The house had once belonged to a wealthy but abusive man who had taken in a servant, a young man with no family, no one who would come looking for him. The servant had been kept in the attic, chained and locked away for years, used as little more than a prisoner. The man had died up there, trapped and alone. No one knows how exactly, whether it was starvation, illness, or something worse. But by the time his body was found, it was too late. His face had twisted in death, forever frozen in a grotesque mask of pain and fear. The wealthy man, terrified of what he had done, buried the body in secret, never telling anyone about the horrors that had happened in that attic. But the other servants had noted the disappearance of the man and the pungent smell that had permeated the attic. The smell of death. But the servant's soul never left. It was trapped there, doomed to repeat the final moments of his life, walking, waiting, begging for release. No one had seen his face since then, at least not anyone who wanted to talk about it. I understood now. The man I'd seen that night wasn't human. He wasn't just a ghost. He was a trapped soul, stuck in that attic, forever repeating the agony of his imprisonment. And now I knew why he had looked at me with such desperation. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was asking for help. Help he would never receive. I haven't been back to that house in years, but every so often, I still hear the sound of footsteps above me when I'm lying in bed, like the echo of a memory. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of that man in the attic, his twisted face, his hollow eyes, his voice whispering those same words over and over again.
Help me.
Deep down, I think I feel guilt that no one had done anything to help this poor trapped soul. It was a Thursday night, and I was getting ready for bed after a long day of work. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as I scrolled through my phone, trying to relax. It was just after 10:30 p.m. when my phone rang. I looked at the screen, a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something made me answer.
Hello?
I said, my voice cautious. At first, there was nothing, just a few seconds of dead air. But then I heard it, breathing. Slow, deliberate, like someone was standing right next to the phone. My heart started to race.
Hello?
I said again, a little louder, trying to hide the unease creeping into my voice. The breathing continued, and then, finally, a voice whispered, "I'm in the house." I froze. My grip tightened on the phone as I glanced around my dark bedroom. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the voice on the other end was too calm, too cold. My first thought was that someone was playing a sick prank on me, but the unease I felt was real, like a knot tightening in my stomach. I hung up and immediately went into action, grabbing the baseball bat I kept in my closet for protection. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked around the house, checking every door and window. Everything was locked, exactly as I had left it. There was no sign of forced entry, no open windows, no broken locks. But the voice still echoed in my mind. I'm in the house. Once I was sure the house was secure, I went back to my bedroom. That's when I noticed it. The chair from my desk, the one that had been pushed neatly under it when I left, was now sitting in the middle of the room. I froze in place, staring at the chair. My stomach turned, and every hair on my body stood on end. I had only been gone a few minutes to check the house, and now this. I gripped the baseball bat tighter, my knuckles turning white. My mind raced. How could the chair have moved? Someone must have been in the house. While I was checking the locks, I walked slowly over to the chair, heart racing, and searched the room, the closet, the corners, under the bed. Nothing. There was no one there, but the unsettling feeling remained. Terrified, I locked myself in the bedroom and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I told the operator about the call and the chair being moved. I was halfway through explaining when my phone buzzed again. Another call. I looked at the screen, and my blood ran cold. It was the same number. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but something compelled me to answer.
Who are you? What do you want?
I demanded, my voice trembling. There was a brief silence, and then the same voice from before, low and chilling. "I'm outside your bedroom door." On cue, the doorknob turned slowly. I screamed, dropping the phone. The sound of my scream echoed in the room, and I scrambled to pick up the phone again, telling the 911 operator what had just happened. They assured me the police were on their way. I stood there, clutching the bat in one hand, the phone in the other, staring at the door, waiting for someone to break it down. But nothing happened. When the police arrived, they did a full sweep of the house. They checked the attic, the basement, every closet and corner. But everything was locked down tight. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no disturbances, other than the chair, which I had shoved back under the desk. The officers gave me a look, one of pity, and assured me that it was probably a prank call. They said they would file a report and suggested I keep the house locked up. "If there are any changes, call us," one of them said before they left. I wanted to believe it was just a prank. I really did, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I locked all the doors again, shut off the lights, and climbed back into bed. The rest of the night was uneventful, and I forced myself to sleep, exhausted from the panic and fear. The next morning, I got up, still rattled, but telling myself it was over. I walked downstairs to make coffee, but as I stepped into the kitchen, my blood turned to ice. All of the chairs from my dining table were stacked on top of each other, forming a pyramid. They hadn't been like that last night. There was no way I could have done that in my sleep. I stood there, staring at the impossible arrangement, my mind spinning. Someone, or something, had been in my house. For the next few days, strange things kept happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear noises, soft, unidentifiable sounds, like something shifting in the walls or the attic. Sometimes it sounded like faint footsteps, but when I checked, I found nothing. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening, too scared to sleep. Then, a few days later, the phone rang again. This time, the number was gibberish, just random symbols and numbers, nothing that made any sense. My hands shook as I answered, fury boiling inside me. Whoever this was, they were toying with me, driving me insane.
What do you want? Stop calling me. I'm going to call the police, and they're going to—
Go on. The voice interrupted me, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was deeper, darker, and had an inhuman growl to it. The voice said with a sinister laugh, bubbling through the line. Let's see what they can do to help you. My heart pounded in my chest. I was gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. But before I could respond, the line went dead. The silence was deafening. I dropped the phone, the chill running through my body so strong I felt paralyzed. This wasn't just a prank. It wasn't just someone trying to scare me. It was something else, something I couldn't understand. And it was playing with me, daring me to fight back. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. And I have a feeling, whatever this is, it's just getting started.